Achilles. The topic of the patch. The god that got completely destroyed. The god that is now useless. RIP Achilles. Completely no reason to play him anymore. Or whatever that was. So, in the most recent patch, Achilles saw various nerfs across the board. And that is after he actually got a set of buffs not too long ago, or rather one buff. He got a buff in patch 6.3 that increases heal from 23 to 35 to 24 to 40. So actually a change that helped him a little bit. And there was even a long explanation as to why this was done. If you're reading ahead, you may notice quite a few warriors on this list. One of our goals in Season 6 was to bring back warriors into solo lane. While the Totem of Ku and buffs to Warrior's Blessing seem to have done this, some warriors are still underperforming. While they aren't too far off, we want to help these warriors to ensure a diverse pool of solo lane contenders. Rather than improving their burst, we want to focus on the defensive capabilities, allowing them to get into mid and late game teamfights more effectively and disrupt their opponents. Achilles' Radiant Glory is a conditional heal that requires him to hit multiple targets with his abilities. We want to better reward him for successfully accomplishing this, especially during the teamfight phase. It's worth noting that in the same patch, Bellona also got a minor buff, who is now also seeing a nerf. So it was definitely successful in bringing these warriors back into solo lane, and maybe a little bit too successful. But we also have to note that Hi-Rez already stated back then that their goal was to up the defensive capabilities. What we're seeing now is a nerf to the offensive capabilities, so it doesn't necessarily contradict each other. The description by Hi-Rez was as follows for this change. Achilles has been showing off in the solo lane, displaying a sharp rise in both the SPL and in ranked ban rates. His late game damage potential pushes him above other warriors, resulting in substantial burst damage that is difficult to react to. Radiant Glory's raw power increase combined with combat dust scaling make for some heavy hitting attacks. We are lowering the damage potential of these abilities while also updating his basic attack range. The animation for his attack did not match the full 16 range and put him at a distinct advantage when boxing against guards with the standard 12 range. General decreased basic attack range from 16 to 12. Radiant Glory decreased power percentage buff from 10 to 20% to 10 to 14%. So instead of a 2.5% increase per rank, we only have a 1% increase per rank. Combat dodge decreased physical power scaling from 50% to 45%. Now if we see changes like this, then a big question is of course, are these changes warranted? If we purely look at the ranked stats here, I would say no. I'm not sure if the stats for patch 6.6 are accurate at the moment, but at least on patch 6.5, he had a 47% win rate with a 30% pick rate and a 36% ban rate. So he was pretty popular, but he wasn't actually very performant. But then again, if a god is also banned fairly often, that often has an impact on the performance overall as well, maybe a little bit overvalued here and there. But those are the stats from SMITE.gg. How do the stats from the SPL look? Blues Ultra has listed those as usual, and here we can actually see somewhat of a similar picture. The win rate is again 47%, so in a sense his performance is similar, but at the same time he has 37 bans and 61 picks with 29 wins, meaning he is overall valued a lot and played a lot, and that usually means a lot in the SPL already, and the win rate is often shifted simply by the not so good team playing him more often or trying to win with him, and other teams having better counter strats to the top picks. So I would say based on that, a nerf is warranted. A win rate so close to 50% with a high pick rate in the SPL is usually a sign of the character being relatively strong. But what do the nerfs really change? I think that is definitely worth looking at here for the individual parts. The first one is the basic attack range. Now, when it comes to basic attack range, there is something that needs to be understood first. The basic attack range for characters with 16 units instead of 12 is a little bit different. They have a little bit more of a line, less wide attack, but instead they reach further out. And usually that is beneficial because the wider attack often doesn't matter that much because you're gonna try and face your enemy anyways when using your basic attack. So it's a benefit. And when this was introduced on Eveline, it was clearly said that this was a specific benefit for her and basically weaved well into her kit where she has to close the distance to enemies with basic attacks first before she can effectively use her abilities. If you don't know, you need to use basic attacks before you can get the most out of your feather step. So it was inherently built into the kit for that. And it was an interesting feature, and Hi-Rez kind of, I guess, decided to go with it again on some characters. In the context of Cuchulainn, it was apparently done because his visuals for the basic attacks in the Berserk form look kind of off otherwise because he's too big if the range is shorter, and the range was supposed to match that form in the normal form as well, because otherwise you get this weird feeling where your basic attack range constantly changes. That is debatable. I think it would have been okay to have a shorter range in one of the forms, but that's just what Hi-Rez went with here. I don't think he needed that advantage. Bellona has this benefit as well, this extra range, but for her it's specifically limited to the 3, so that's a completely different story altogether, where that is the perk of that particular weapon, like when you use that particular weapon along with the healing that you get for it. In Achilles' case, we don't really have a justification. It was done as an afterthought, I guess, of a different attack style that he may have had in earlier testing, but his kit is relatively in your face enough, and it also has many tools that allow you to get close to the enemy and actually apply basic attacks. And I somehow heard from some people that they thought this was the biggest nerf this patch for Achilles, and I'm not so sure this was really that big of a nerf in the first place. I've played Achilles in support, I've played him in solo, and I've played him in jungle to see if I felt the impact anywhere, and the only place where I really felt this a little bit was in jungle, and that was not actually in relevant fights, because in fights you're always going to try and use your stun to close the distance and to get your basic off, and you're always going to use your combat dodge to get as close as possible before the basic even. But when it actually happened was with jungle camps, where I just accidentally kind of used the basic at a distance where I thought I was going to hit, but didn't because I had a little less range. That happened, I think, 3 times across the match or something. And it's something to get used to in a very short time, and it's definitely not a big problem. It's not anything that will break Achilles. For the other 2 parts, we should look into some more math. Now, the second part, the Radiant Glory itself, obviously doesn't change immediately, because on the early ranks it's still, or the earliest rank, it's still exactly the same. And most of the time you level your 1 and your 3 before you even put points in the 2. It's a bit situational, of course. There are situations where you might want to level the 2 first. I did this in solo lane when I was against a heavy sustain enemy, and I knew I wasn't gonna really be able to kill them, so I figured instead I'm just gonna go into sustain myself, and for that going into 2 can be good, but most of the time you're probably going into Shield of Achilles and into combat dodge, and the only thing that you're not leveling beforehand is Fatal Strike. So you get the difference here relatively late, and for the early game there's just no difference in power that you get at all. But of course, at the later stages it will have an impact. The impact from the combat dodge is felt from the moment you have anything to scale with, basically, as it is 5% scaling off the ability, and as you're usually able to use it twice, you will have 10% scaling less. So that's a little bit damage just off the top there. So what does that mean if you have old Achilles and new Achilles in comparison? Old Achilles had his 20% scaling, and new Achilles has 14% scaling at max rank. If we had a not so power focused build, or we're not completely done with the build, then we'd have like 150 power maybe. Now, the increase from the scaling would turn that into 180 power in the old version and 171 in the new version. The total scaling between your 1, your 3 and 2 basic attacks would be 3.9 or 390% in the old version and 3.8 in the new version. Keep in mind this is just scaling, this is not including any base damage values or any penetration against protection or something, just the raw damage here from the scaling. That means the total damage of the scaling in the old version would have been 702. In the new version it's going to be 649 or rounded 650, so 52 damage less. That Sounds like a little bit, but if you then factor in that through the protections, that gets a little bit reduced in difference as well, and the fact that the base damage is on top of all of that, which is also a significant portion of extra damage, it's actually not that much. It's not a massive difference. And for comparison's sake, I also did that with a build that has 200 power, a little bit later. Here we'd end up with 240 power versus 228 power, and after all the scalings are factored in, we would have 936 damage versus 866 damage. It's a little bit more here, we have 70 damage difference, but really, at the end of the day, that is still not massive. Again, after protections and everything are factored in, this gap is even smaller. But what's worth keeping in mind is that even though it's a relatively small value, this can be important for Achilles, because Achilles has the goal of getting the enemy under the threshold with his combo ideally, so that he can execute them, especially if you're playing him in a more damaging position, say for example as a jungler. In that regard, every little bit of damage counts, and if it's just that tiny little bit that you have less now, it can still have an impact, and there were a few situations where I noticed this. It would also become slightly more noticeable if you're able to consistently spam basic attacks on a target, for example. But at the end of the day, the difference is so minor that it's not as big as, for example, missing a single basic attack in a fight or hitting it. So I don't think it makes or breaks the character. Overall, I would say those are some good adjustments to Achilles to make him a little less overwhelming and shift his damage down a little bit, even though it unfortunately hits jungle Achilles a little bit harder than solo Achilles, which I don't really think was the purpose, but that's just kind of circumstance if you're reducing scaling. But I don't think it destroys Achilles or makes him unviable or anything like that. I think a big selling point for Achilles will remain that he has an execute as a solo warrior, and nothing of that got taken away. If they adjusted those values, then maybe we would have more to talk about. But I think for now, Achilles is still very much playable, and especially the part with the range is something that is just a bit overrated in my opinion. I don't think it's really doing as much as you think, as long as you're playing Achilles right and try to stick as close to the enemy as possible. I understand that not everyone will share this perspective, but this is my take after having tested him thoroughly in all roles after the patch. And before I leave, I quickly want to shout out my members. I haven't done that in a while, being Xerbus, Enigma Show, The Walden Twin, Fro Double G Gaming, Jado85, Richard Thompson, R. Rowers, and Kenny Olsen. With that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you enjoyed it, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.